Here we go. Money talk.
Here comes the money. Money, 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 money.
Dollar, dollar. Dollar, dollar.
Another great episode of DubCast coming down the pike. As a reminder, every couple weeks we'll hop in the lab with one of the sports betting industry's top handicappers to get a little bit of their background, their approach to the game, and what makes them special. Super fun interview this week. The masked man himself, Lucha Larry's Locks, the handicapper you know as Larry Locke, is joining us today for a special demasking / deep dive on his background and handicapping approach. Known to many by Lucha Larry, known to others as simply Bill. Bill, why don't you say hello to the listeners at home and give everybody a treat by taking off the mask? This is like a very cool moment.
This is a big moment.
Yeah, no
this is
kidding.
a big moment. This is like, the luchadors do in wrestling when they finally get defeated and have a demasking. It's like the biggest event in their history. But, yeah, I just did this as a fun thing, as a moniker for the pseudonym. But, yeah, I don't need this on. I can't breathe. I wear enough mask with this COVID shit going on. So we'll rip that off. We'll put the real mask on, the Villanova cap, because I've kind of been in hiding this year. They don't seem to be the same team as they've been in the past. But yeah, this is me. This is my face. It's ginormous. I know. That's kind of why I wore the mask, to kind of hide the enormous chipmunk cheeks I still have. But it's all good. Thanks for having me on, guys.
In all his glory, I feel like we just watched the unmasking of Kane in WWE or something. So if we just broke the
nice.
internet, sorry about that, Zuckerberg.
Just give me his bank account. I'll be real happy.
So, Bill, Lucha Larry, you are one of the more interesting kind of backstory cats out there in this crazy world of Twitter handicapping, etc. Why don't you just take a couple minutes, give us kind of your origin story for maybe listeners who aren't as familiar with you or who are, but want to know the man behind the mask. How did you get into this crazy world?
It's an odd story, to say the least. I've been involved with betting, gambling, fantasy sports, March Madness pools, all that kind of stuff since as early as I can remember. I tell everybody the same story. The first time I can remember being involved with it was my dad. He's a retired ironworker, but he came home with one of those parlay slips that you see, I guess in like a vintage store now, because they're not really around anymore. But that was my first introduction to sports gambling. My dad's like, hey, pick a couple of these teams, circle them, and if we win, I'll split the money with you. So my first time doing it, I just picked, I was a big Michigan fan. Obviously, I'm from the Philadelphia area too, so picked a couple Philly teams. So I guess I had the Eagles on there. I probably had Penn State, because at the time I was dumb and was a fan of Penn State too. But all my teams won, and I was like super excited. My dad was at work the next day, or that Monday. He comes home, and I'm like, all right, Dad, how much did we win? He's like, what are you talking about? We didn't win anything. I'm like, what do you mean? All my teams won. And he's like, no, see this number next to it? That's how many points they would have to win by or they can afford to lose by. And I was like, oh, all right. So figuring out how that worked. And then as I grew in my academic career, I ended up being a history major. So I loved research. I loved figuring out the story behind the story. So that kind of played a part in it. But then real life, came. I needed to make real money and have a real job out of college. And I started off in a career in a sports and rec department. I did that for 10 years. Started a young family. I moved. So a lot of things were changing. My time commitment was way too much to the job and not enough to my family. So I ended up leaving that job. And in the meantime, figured, you know what? Let me give this whole handicapping thing a try. I'd seen it on Twitter. I actually had a younger guy who worked for me in my old life who had gotten into it, and he became one of the larger handicappers over the past few years. And I'm like, if he can do it, I can probably do it. So let me start getting into it. And when I had more time on my hands and I figured out deeper dives to do as far as research and handicapping, it became a little bit easier to me. And I just started out as free. I think it was January of 2019 on Twitter, and was on a really, really nice run. It just so happened to be during the time that I typically do the best with college basketball. And I had a ton of followers out of the gate to start following me. Bumped it up to a VIP service, grew that for a bit, and now jumped onto Dub Club, which is the next big thing with sports handicapping. If any handicappers are out there listening and you're not on Dub Club, you need to get on it, because these guys, as you know, Lewis won't be able to say it because he's too humble, but honestly, these guys are phenomenal. They do everything on the back end for us that we need. They're always coming up with ideas that are helpful to us, so I'm super, super appreciative to be a part of Dub Club, and I'm excited for where these guys are going in the future. So thanks for having me on, and thanks for having me a part of it.
I always love when the interview starts with you guys gassing us up. It's supposed to be the other way around, but much appreciated. So maybe I can return the favor now. You are probably the best college basketball first half better in the history of humankind. And I don't want to undersell kind of your broader package, because you're a guy who caps every single sport, ton of volume, every single day, et cetera, et cetera. We'll talk about that in a second, but let's start with, I think, what you're known for, which is like first half spreads, college hoops. How did you get into that? Because, I mean, it's kind of niche in a world where there are plenty of people with niches, but first half college hoops for, I would say, mostly mid-majors. How did you find that as like your sweetest of the sweet spots, and how do you go about working through a given day's card and picking the right value?
Yeah, so I think it happened, I guess it was 2 seasons ago with college basketball. I'm a huge sucker for mid-majors. I know it's probably a detriment to the number of clients I can possibly get, because not many people like watching that. People are more in tune with, you know, the Big 12 SEC games that are happening. But I just loved watching them, and I always thought there was value in taking them, because there wasn't as much action being placed on those teams. So I felt like the more knowledge that I can get on these teams, I have an advantage over the books, because they're really not spending that much time on them, because there's not that much money on them, right? Like if a team like last night with Kansas and Texas Tech that probably has a ton of volume on the game, like the books are paying attention way more to that because of the volume than they are Fairfield versus Marist, right? And then, you know, the penchant for like, I want to get an answer quick kind of factored into it. You know, you can see how no runs in first inning thing's a huge deal. First touchdowns of NFL games are huge deals now. So this is a way to kind of cut that back. Another thing that I saw was, like, believe it or not, home court advantage for these mid-majors is as big, if not bigger, than the major programs. And when you're taking a team that's at home, the first half is basically where the biggest part of that advantage comes into play, right? Like, you have a team who might be 0-5 on the road, but they're really strong at home, and you're looking at what they've done over the past X amount of games in the first half, and they've been covering an X amount of games. It's typically because they have this advantage. You know, they come out of the gate fired up. They have the fan support behind them. The opposing teams coming into an arena, some of them never played in it before, especially with COVID, how jacked up the schedule's been the last 2 years. So you have those opponents coming in. I just feel like there's an advantage to it, and the more I can take advantage of it, I will. And I also have seen it where, you know, that first half covers. Honestly, my favorite thing to see is if I take a first half and it covers, but the team that I took loses in the second half, they don't cover the whole game. Like, to me, that is like the ultimate, because it's just proving the point. It's driving it home that the first half is super important for these mid-majors, especially when they have the home court advantage. So that's kind of where it lied. And again, I just like getting my answer in the first half instead of having to wait for, you know, the full game to play out.
It's interesting because the first half, and especially what you said, picking home teams, I feel like the books, especially in, like you said, mid-majors, spots where there's not a ton of volume on games, aren't really baking it into their pricing and the odds, which doesn't make sense. And clearly you found a way to find some value there.
Absolutely.
I love what you said about kind of wanting an answer fast, and plagiarizing from your own words in a prior conversation. I think you're a capper who's got a bit of ADHD in terms of wanting action in a lot of different spots and looking for edges everywhere.
Right.
Kind of talk us through how that manifests itself in your daily card, what clients get out of you, and kind of when do you sleep, given that you're a guy who definitely has niches like first half college totals, but also has action all over the board. So what's a day in the life of Lucha Larry, and what can...
Man, it's changed. It's changed a lot, especially again with COVID starting. Again, I was really into my quote unquote Twitter handicapping career when COVID hit, right? And my prime sport was dead. I can vividly remember seeing, you know, conference tournament games just dropping like flies and being like, this is terrible. And then, A week went by, still wasn't anything going on. 2 weeks, I'm like, all right, I need to figure out what I'm going to do next. And I started diving into soccer. And I really never capped soccer prior to that. But to me, it's all about the information you can get. And we are so lucky to live in a day and age that we live in where information is super, super accessible and across everything. Like, I think back, I'm an old guy, right? Like, I'm almost 40. And I can think back, like, if I tried to do this as a teenager, like, I could never get information on the Chinese Super League soccer. Like, I would never be able to get any of that stuff. But we have it at our fingertips now, being able to use a computer and researching all this stuff. And to me, every sport, when it comes down to it, it's all the same process. It's just a matter of figuring out which pieces of information per sport is the most important. Where, like, for instance, I'm a huge, and I've said this on plenty of other podcasts that I've been on, I'm a huge believer in reverse line movement. If I see a team who's favored by 5 points and all the action's coming on them, the tickets and the handle, and all of a sudden, instead of being a 5-point favorite, they drop down to a 3.5, 4-point favorite. That makes no sense to me. So I'm right away going to be on the other side of that. That being said, the reverse line movement, you don't typically see that much in, say, soccer. You don't typically see too much in MMA and UFC. So you start to factor other things into your decision-making and your handicap process. So each sport across the board, I feel like, has the same basic information that you need to gather, but it's a matter of figuring out each sport what the niche is, like you said, the niches of each information of the data that you can gather and how to use it. And the last thing I'll say on the front is I'm a huge information guy. Like, I want all the data. I know there's guys out there that are like, I only want to look at 2 things. Like, to me, give me everything. I'll filter it all out. But I'd much rather have too much data than not enough data, because at that point I feel like I'm guessing. If I overthink it, fine. I can live with that. But if I'm going into it blind and making a decision, like, that just doesn't fly for me.
One thing I don't know that a lot of your followers know is that you're also like a very active writer and researcher. Maybe talk about how that informs your process and forces you to kind of go a level deeper than just kind of the blocking and tackling research that maybe the handicapper next door does, because they're not, doing this writing on the side as well. And how, your background as a history dude honestly makes a ton of sense with your handicapping style, right? Because you're attacking the source material, synthesizing it into like a point of view or perspective, and that turns into a play recommendation. So walk us through kind of how that's additive to your handicapping style and kind of the approach itself.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because like I've told people recently, it can kind of be a double-edged sword, right? Like, I know there's guys out there that they will not post plays unless they have analysis to go with it. And I understand that, and I respect that, and I can appreciate that. What I found that started to happen was when I was trying to do that, and I still, again, like you mentioned, I do some writing. I write for two different websites where I get assignments. It's not choices that I make really on my own of the games that I'm going to have to write about. But again, it's the same process that I'm using. So at the end of the day, I do believe that the plays that I give out on my articles, I am just as confident in as I am in the plays that I put out to my clients. And going back into that, like, I have my records saved and all, and they are still at a very, very high percentage, so that's a good thing. But what I found that I started to do was I was trying to build the narrative to fit. I'm sorry, I was starting to pick the play that fit the narrative, and you can't do that, right? Like, that's the one cool thing about sports is it's super unpredictable. No matter how good of a handicap you are, look at the best handicappers in the world hit 56% at its height. Like, so when you think of it that way, it's still a coin flip. So I was starting to make decisions based upon the narratives, and I didn't like that. And I didn't think it was fair to my clients to have that. So I pulled out my analysis part from what I was putting out there to my guys. And you mentioned earlier, I definitely have some ADHD in me. So when I'm going through my process of researching and going through data points, in my head, it's all there. Like, I can see it, like, kind of like how Beautiful Mind type of thing is. But to sit down and spend all the time writing it and then delivering that out to my clients, to me, in a way, it's a waste of time, because that same time and effort that I'm putting into writing all this stuff down, I could be researching, another 25% of games that are on a slate. So that's what I want to focus my attention to. And that's kind of where it came from. But I love writing. I wish I could do it in a more efficient pace, but it is what it is.
What's coming through there, which I think is really powerful about your approach, is A, you're super introspective, trying new stuff and like understanding what's optimally efficient and what's not. And B, your long-term success is insane, and your ability to kind of course correct and maybe tweak your process, like, oh, the write-ups are actually becoming a distraction. It's good to inform the background research, but I shouldn't be, making that kind of the gating item to unlock a play. Since you've been tracking in 2020, you're hitting, 55%, damn near 2,500 bets across 11 leagues, close to 600 units profit. There are ups and downs in that unbelievable long-term track record. What are kind of like the practices or the disciplines that you have to allow yourself to kind of course correct and say, oh, I'm reaching because of this part of my process, I need to tweak it? Because to your point, I think a lot of guys are very set in their process, which can be a strength. But I also think being open-minded and introspective enough to be a little bit more malleable can also be a huge addition. So how do you think about tweaking your process and evolving?
Yeah, I think that's an underrated asset you need to have in terms of handicapping is you have to be adaptive, because just like a handicapper or a bettor is trying to figure out what's going to be a winning process, the biggest enemy in the world is on the other side, the book, right? Like, and they have way more tools at their disposal than we do. So they're changing. We have to be able to change as well. So to your point, if I have a process that's really working and it continues to work, I'm absolutely going to stick with it. But if all of a sudden I start to see a trend where things just aren't going the right way and I'm starting to lose plays that I normally wouldn't be losing, it doesn't make sense to me, it's time to sit back and take a different approach. My MLB season this past season is a prime example of it. I forget the number that I was at. I think I was down over 20 units over the course of the season for MLB only. And it was like over the halfway point. And I'm like, I have to figure out why this isn't working and what do I need to do to change it. And I went back into my process and figured out what exactly I was doing consistently as far as my research that was putting me on the wrong side of the plays. Totally revamped my strategy, and I went from down 20, I think, to up over 20 for the year or something like that. It's like a 40-unit swing in less than 2 months. And to me, I know everybody's unit sizes are different and stuff like that, but to me, that was like one of the most proud moments I had of myself as far as handicapping. And, clients might not feel that way because I probably lost half of them because they were down so much they didn't want to stick with me. I totally understand that. But from my standpoint, I thought that was one of the most impressive things that I was able to do in my handicapping career. But yeah, you got to be adaptive. You have to be able to change your approaches, because if you don't, like, you're just going to get left behind. Like, I see so many guys that are like at the height of height, and all of a sudden they start to dwindle down, and they're losing units, and all of a sudden they start pressing, and because they feel like they have this process it's going to work. Like, eventually it's going to work. And to me, when I hear that and I see that, I'm like, man, that is the most typical gambling anonymous type of personality, right? Like, oh, I'm gonna win. It's only a matter of time. It's like, not necessarily, especially if you start pressing and start bumping your units up. So, yeah, being adaptive to your approach is 100% a factor in being a handicapper.
I think I'm thinking about my own betting and gambling and being able to get up from a blackjack table that's been ice cold and take a walk. It's really kind of a pride thing, right? To say, oh, I need to take a look.
Ego, 100%.
How do you get rid of that? Because I think not only handicappers need to learn that, but the recreational bettors amongst us, the guys who like playing table games, anything competitive where, we're getting feedback that says something needs to be changed in our process, but it's a pride thing to say, oh, I thought I had it all figured out. So how do you think about abstracting away the pride and just focused on the task and the process?
Yeah, it's not an easy task at all. I tell people that all the time. Like, the number one thing as far as being a bettor or being a handicapper is you need to be able to let go of the bad days. Because if you don't, it's going to, one, eat you up. And if it does that, it's going to take away from what your process is, right? Like, you're not going to be thinking about the next games and what you're researching and what data you're pulling in. You're thinking about the night before and what went wrong and all that kind of stuff. Like, you need to be able to push that aside. And I'm sure it's different for everybody. But I kind of personally, I look back at what I did months before, right? Like I know, and I struggle with it every time I have a losing day or two in a row. Like I struggle with it. I think like, what am I doing? Like, do I even belong in this industry? Because I just lost these 3 days or these 4 days, or like right now it's January 25th. I am most likely going to finish in the negative units for this month, unless I really turn things around the next few days. But again, I don't want to force the issue and bump my units up, because that's not going to be a good thing. But to let that go and look back at my previous track record, like, okay, I can't remember, I don't have my numbers in front of me, but I had one of the worst months of my career in my first year, and I bounced back from that. Like, it was like negative 40 units, I think, in a month, and over the next 2 months, I recouped that and then some. And obviously from there, I kept building and building and building. But I think the real important part is, like you mentioned, being at a blackjack table gets cold. Get up and walk away. Like, you need to be able to do that. And the ego and the pride, you have to be able to put that aside. Like, for instance, I'm struggling right now, but I think when I look back at my numbers, it's because I was adding too much NBA. I was adding MMA in there, which I do love, but at the same time, it's not being profitable. So I have to pull away from that and get back to what I do best, not just college basketball for this season. I truly believe that's going to turn things around for me. But if you don't do that, if you continue to keep diving in, I want to figure this out, like, you're going to put yourself in a bad spot. And this, at the same time, to me, when I'm on a heater, whether it's, you know, being at a table game at a casino or it's sports handicapping, I'm pressing it and pressing it and pressing it and pressing it, because at that point, like, you know, you're going to continue to win. You're going to hit a spot where you're going to lose, right? But then you dial it back from that point. Like you mentioned blackjack. When I play blackjack at a casino, you know, whatever the minimum is, say 25 is the minimum, I play 25. If I hit 2 hands in a row, I'm bumping that up. And then if I hit that, I'm bumping it up. You're consistently bumping the amount up, because if you don't, you're just constantly winning at the same rate. You're not making as much money as you would, because you know that when you lose, right, like, everybody's like, oh, I lost 20. Let me put 50 on this one to try and make it back, and then some. So you kind of have to, like, just reverse engineer your brain into thinking the exact opposite way when it comes to heaters and coolers. So that would be my answer for that one.
Super interesting. What I'm hearing is what I also talk to subscribers about all the time. And the analogy being like the stock market. You're investing for the long term, right? There's going to be ebbs and flows. It's not about trying to time the market. It's about investing in a great, you know, the stock market analogy is a great fund manager. In the sports betting world, it's a great handicapper who's earned the confidence over the long term to kind of understand where the toggles are, where to tweak left, where to tweak right, to get back on the right foot and be profitable over the long term. So it's doesn't make it any easier, but I think there's a lot of analogies that are helpful in terms of looking at stock market and kind of being long term oriented.
No, you're 100% right, and it's a whole culture thing, right? Like, it's frustrating for me. I get it, but it's frustrating that so many people out there don't understand what you're saying. And I tell people all the time. I tell them now in the beginning of the month on Dub Club, the first of the month, because I always have new subscribers and stuff, I let them know. And I tell everybody I talk to, I'm not a lottery ticket. I am not that. You're going to see guys posting all the time if they hit a 10-team parlay, whatever. Like, okay, great. But then what? You know, and if you're in the business for that, to try and win big, fast, you're going to crash and burn real quick. So as non-sexy as it may be to win a couple units here and there a week, it adds up, you know. And I tell people all the time, you mentioned it's like the stock market. It's the stock market, but it's way more fun. Like, you get to watch in action your investment and see how it plays out. I don't think there's anything else in the world where you can do that. That's what makes it so great. But again, I can't stress it enough, and I tell people all the time, it's a long-term game. It is a marathon, not a sprint. It sounds cliche, but it's 100% the truth. So it is what it is.
Love it. Maybe we'll switch gears a bit here towards more the community aspect of what you do, because I think sports betting Twitter can be a nasty place where, to some handicappers, it feels zero-sum, right? Like you're feeding in the same pond of fish, and a lot of people can become very cutthroat or just dismissive of other cappers and even like haters. Whereas your approach is very much community-oriented, building people up, gassing people up, retweeting all the time. Why, A, has that been the approach you've taken? and kind of, what are some of the fruits that have been born out of just being like a plus member of this community? Because I think that's what it really is.
Yeah, I mean, like, look, let's think about it from, take away gambling Twitter, right? Let's just think about it as life, right? Like, when you're a negative person and you're consistently putting people down, what is that doing for yourself? It's not making you feel better. You might think it's making yourself feel better for the short term, but in the long term, like, you're miserable. And why would you want to take that and put it in again? This is so fun. This industry is one of a kind. It's something that anybody can do, and you make money while you're doing it. It's the greatest thing in the world, in my perspective. So why do I want to be negative and put other people down when all they're trying to do is just be a part of, like you said, this community and have fun doing it? So, like, yeah, there's tons of new cappers that pop up. I get DMs all the time from guys with like 50 followers, like, "Hey man, can you shoot me a retweet? I'm just getting started." Like, and I know guys out there like, "Why? What's the benefit for me? You only have 50 followers." I don't know. Like, is it really going to kill you to send them a retweet? Like, do you really think, like, are you that self-conscious that you think you're going to lose subscribers or VIPs to this guy who's just starting out because you retweeted for him? Like, if that's the case, then you shouldn't be in this industry. I look at it as, hey, that guy's got 50, followers right now. In a year from now, that guy might have 50,000 followers because he does something, within the community that I don't do, and it could be beneficial to me down the line. And a case in point is, I don't know who it was from Dub Club now, but from your guys' previous Twitter handle where you guys were following me, reached out and asked me to do a quick survey from handicappers. And I could have as easily just deleted that and just forgotten about it. But I'm like, you know what? These guys are going to take the time to do something, whatever it was, if it was for school or if it was for your own research. It's going to take me, 1 minute to fill it out? Let me fill it out. And from that, here we are. We're sitting here doing a podcast on what I think is going to be eventually the biggest platform for handicappers in Dub Club. And that never would have happened if I was just being a jerk and just deleted that DM. So I'm a big believer in paying it forward and giving other people opportunities, because in the end, it's either going to come back and help you, or at very, very worst, it's never going to bite you in the ass. Where if you're a dick to somebody and you're putting them off, it's going to turn around and it's going to come back on you and you're going to look like the jerk. So that's just kind of my mentality with it. It's a way to live by. And you're right, though. It can be a very, very toxic environment, but I believe, if you're not the toxic person, that kind of like leaves itself to the side. You don't really have to deal with it as much. So
super interesting. And for listeners at home who may not know, Bill, Larry's Locks was one of the first handicappers to start leveraging Dub Club, was instrumental in us kind of standing up the first product. Would love to kind of give you a few minutes now to kind of pitch what subscribers could expect from your Dub Club feed. I think the depth of your analysis and your unique approach has already come through quite clearly. But I don't know. To your point, I think when we set about making Dub Club, the whole idea was to have Twitter really be that community, that engagement, that social layer, and then create this premium experience to where you could really build a business. How have you kind of, now that it's in your hands in the wild, how have you been leveraging the software? What have your clients' feedback looked like? And maybe a prospective client who's liked what he's hearing so far, what can they expect from your feed?
I think the number one thing is, for me personally, I guess, is we just talked about how Twitter can be toxic, right? To me, what Dub Club does from my perspective as a handicapper is you guys kind of filter out the toxicity of other handicappers. Like, we have our own group chat, we have communication with each other, and I think that is super helpful, not only for the handicapper, but in turn, it's going to be helpful for the client. Because if you have a handicapper that you're a client of, and they're dealing with all this bullshit out there, right, that Twitter is notorious for, again, it's just taking away from their process. It's putting them in a position where they're not going to be successful. Dub Club, I don't really engage with that many people in the handicap realm outside of our group with Dub Club. And honestly, like, I feel better about it, because no matter what, in all these other group chats and whatever, you're always going to have one or two clowns, all it is negative, negative, negative. Like, we don't need that here. And I think that's the cool thing about Dub Club from a handicapper's perspective, is it's just one really good community that takes away that toxicity that you said that Twitter is. And in turn, from a client's perspective, right, like, it's hard. Like when you go on Twitter for the first time and you're trying to figure out, okay, who do I want to follow? Who do I want to tail? And then ultimately, who am I going to want to invest my money in as a handicapper? Dude, between scam artists, between people who just don't care at all really about what they're doing. They're just throwing stuff out there hoping it sticks. It's hard. It is not easy. And I think what you guys are doing with Dub Club is, I know you had mentioned before, you're trying to filter out the noise of Twitter, of gambling Twitter. To me, that's what the noise is. It's the BS. It's not like, yeah, you're going to have political stuff that pops up, but it's all dependent upon what you're following. But if you can take out that toxic part of this unreal community, because honest to God, if you talk to any handicapper out there, they're going to tell you the same thing, that they met some incredible people through this, and they've met some of the worst people in the world through this. And again, I think Dub Club is filtering out those terrible people, letting them live on Twitter, gambling Twitter alone. And hey, I don't know what your guys' ultimate goal is, but I would hope in the coming years that Dub Club is the new gambling Twitter, but it's kind of a, you know, and I'm being real cliche, but a utopian society of what gambling Twitter should be. So I'm proud to be a part of it from the start. I'm super excited for where you guys are going and where we can take all of our clients as a group, because again, I have my own subscription base, but at the end of the day, Dub Club has a ton of people that are on it, and we're all about the same thing. We want to beat the book. We want to have people make money and have fun doing it.
Phenomenal interview. Always good to catch up. Special treat for new subscribers to Larry's feed. Enter promo code LarryDubCast at checkout for 25% off your first period. Bill, the unmasking was awesome. The content of the interview was even better. Always a blast to catch up. And wishing you winners only here as we come down the stretch in Jan and get closer and closer to March Madness, which is
oh man,
busy part for you. Yeah, seriously.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on, guys. Appreciate it.
So fun.